I want to start just a little bit by sharing a little bit of my personal background that provides a little bit of context into the work that I do. As was mentioned in the introduction, I came to the US in 1991 as an undocumented immigrant from Pakistan. And I landed in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Anybody from Oklahoma here? Hey, where from? Okmulgee, not too far. 1991, right after the first Gulf War, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma was a very fast introduction to race in America for a young immigrant brown kid. My first day of school, a classmate of mine who became a tormentor and bully for the next 4 years said, and we don't have any little kids here, right? You're a fucking sand nigger, what are you doing here? My third day of school, after I had made a couple of friends, a Mexican kid, a black kid, and a Icelandic exchange student, he came up to the table I was sitting on in the morning and said, well, at least you sand niggers are better than these niggers, referring to the black kid. And it was, at that point, something that I didn't understand, but it was the creation of, it was a indication to the racial hierarchy that I was stepping into. You may be bad, but we still have hierarchies, and you have to be above these people, and they have to be below you. And as I saw my family acclimate to the US, I saw how that hierarchy gets internalized in our families, in our communities, and even we may be treated like crap, but we still get treated better than that, so we're just going to stay quiet and accept the treatment that we get. This was my introduction to the United States and race politics. Being undocumented, my family was also working class. For many South Asian folks, class, and many immigrant communities, class is an often untalked about dynamic. Our American society has gotten not necessarily good at actual race realities, but is able to talk about race quite more openly than it can talk about class. And what I found was that the leadership of our communities, of South Asian and Muslim communities, who were often the doctors, engineers, and lawyers, who set the agenda of what impacts a community and what the community should be doing, was vastly different than that of working class folks, those who worked in the gas stations and did the menial work, which makes things run. And so when my brother ended up in deportation proceedings, the community thought that that was not an important issue. And actually that we don't want to associate with those types of folks, and you stay over there and we'll stay over here. When my cousin, who worked at the gas station, was targeted and entrapped in a war on drugs case, where an undercover officer was sent in, built a relationship with my cousin, came over to his house for dinner multiple times, and then asked, can you sell me these stay awake bottles? And after he did so, he was arrested and sent to 6 years in prison. The community leaders of our own community stood against people like my cousin who had been targeted and were now serving prison because they wanted to stand out as good immigrants. And so these were politically formative years for me. I was an angry brown kid. I hated where I was, I hated people around me, and it wasn't until I got to college that I started to learn about, well, actually no, even in high school, I started to learn about other communities and other people that had experienced similar struggles, and by much more seriously impactful and heavy struggles. And in particular, African-American communities. Learning the histories of Malcolm X, learning the histories of the Black Panther Party, learning the struggles of indigenous communities, started to give me a sense that my struggles and the struggles of my communities were in a continuity of struggles before us and along with us. And then I moved to New York in 1999 and 2000, and I was looking to engage in this political development. I was also reading Eqbal Ahmad at that same time, which in particular gave me for those that are familiar with his writings, a particular understanding and focus on state violence. That there are multiple forms of violence, there's multiple forms of terrorism, but without doubt, the greatest perpetrator of violence, the greatest perpetrator of terrorism is the state. And so in August of 2000, I was looking to engage my political work. I came across an organization that did SAT classes and basketball with South Asian kids, and I was like, oh, that sounds cool. Set up an appointment, was gonna go meet up with them, and then I found an old flyer which talked about a vigil in solidarity with Amadou Diallo. How many people here know that name? Amadou Diallo was a New York City West African immigrant and street vendor who was killed in a hail of 41 bullets by the NYPD in 1999, in February of 1999. And the officers who killed him were all acquitted in April of 2000, March or April of 2000. And DRUM, a South Asian organization, organized a vigil, a rally against that acquittal in Jackson Heights, a South Asian neighborhood, and talked about the importance of building solidarity across South Asian immigrant communities with Black and Latino communities who face the vast majority of the brutality of police violence. And I found this flyer, and I fell in love with the flyer. I called up a number. We used to have these things called pagers, which some of you may not be familiar with. And I got a call back 3 days later saying like, hey, who are you? Went to go meet up with some folks, got interrogated for 3 hours in a dusty office, and joined DRUM and have been active with the organization since then. So DRUM, as was mentioned, Desis Rising Up and Moving is an organization of low-income South Asian and Indo-Caribbean workers, immigrants, and youth. It is essentially like a community-based union. So people join as members, and as members, they are part of the organization, and they help determine the direction, the work, and the focus of the organization. And it is an organization that is particularly focused on state violence, because it is what impacts our communities the most, and it is those issues which are the least talked about, the least spoken about, particularly by traditional leadership within our communities. I want to share a few stories which reflect, just to highlight what some of our work looks like. Our racial justice work is around surveillance of Muslim communities and around everyday policing. Shahina is one of our members who's been active for 11 years, maybe late 40s, Pakistani woman. Came from Pakistan, escaping persecution as a religious minority. Came to the US, were undocumented. Father and son were working odd jobs, eventually working at an Islamic bookstore. Right next to a masjid, which was highly targeted post 9/11 by police and by the FBI. The son gets approached by an informant, somebody that's working for the NYPD, who builds a relationship with him over a course of 1.5 years. 6 months building just a relationship, 6 months gaining the trust, and then another 6 months starting to share with him, do you see what's happening in Iraq? Do you see what's happening in Palestine? Do you see what they're doing to our people? And when this young person became angry and agitated after seeing pictures, after seeing videos, after seeing all this inflammatory material, he started poking at him. What are you going to do about it? You have an obligation to do something about our people. And the minute he said, let's do something, it becomes a plot. He gets arrested, he gets put on trial, and he is now serving 30 years in prison. What helps to understand the situation better is the informant is paid $100,000 for his work, and Mateen has an IQ of 79. If I gave any one of you $100,000 and told you to produce some results, I'm sure you could make somebody that has an IQ of 79 do anything that you wanted them to do. The day that Mateen was sentenced, that night, Shahina went home, and at 4 a.m. they hear loud banging on their door, and as they open the door, about 20 ICE officers rush inside, arrest the mother, arrest the sister, and arrest the father, and haul them off to immigration jail, even though they have a pending case. We work with them to get them out, and since then, Shahina's been at the front lines at talking about what the war on terror actually means for our communities. Some of the folks here that are involved in New York City circles often know of her, but there are hundreds of those families within Muslim communities across this country who have been fighting for their families and who have been trying to highlight what these policies actually mean for their families and their communities on a day-to-day basis. Our communities are filled with such informants and undercover officers. Some of them willing to do this work in exchange for money or in exchange for having their records cleared. Some of them just, we did surveys, we found a community leader whose son was arrested for marijuana possession, and the FBI came to him and said, if you cooperate with us, we'll make your son's charge go away. So some people just get intimidated or forced into it. I want to talk about Nilesh, a now probably 23-year-old, but when he joined the organization when he was 18, because the school that he went to said that he was not good enough and that it would be better for him if he dropped out of school. This was actually said to him by his school counselor. And Nilesh's everyday school experience was that on the way to school or the way from school, he would get stopped by a couple of officers in the neighborhood who would throw him against the wall and feel him up and search him, what later came to be known as stop and frisk in New York City. By the time Nilesh was 20, he had been stopped and frisked 24 times on his way to and from school and in the neighborhood. We have other youth members, Moiner, Praz, and Mo, who have been stopped and frisked 80 times by the time they're 21 years old. And I would say in our community, we face this a lot less. So we can imagine black youth in Jamaica or in East New York is probably a lot more so. This is the everyday experience of young people in New York City. And so people like Shahina and people like Nilesh have been at the front lines and fighting against what the police are doing in our communities. Speaking to city council, speaking at press conferences, coming to schools and talking about their experiences, talking to other people in the community and agitating them and getting them to turn out to rallies, to meet with city council members, to pressure them, and in one instance, follow around a city council member even to their home until they relented and agreed to sign on to a bill that we had been working on. It's not the lawyers that are leading it. It is the everyday people who are being trained and supported in being able to lead that work. Our immigrant rights work works towards trying to win legalization for the over 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. But with the prospects of legalization being slim, and the continued growth of enforcement in the forms of detentions, deportations, and border militarization. Most of our work focuses on the enforcement. One of our members, Nadra, joined our membership when her husband was picked up by the police and turned over to immigration for allegedly selling fake perfumes on Canal Street. He ended up being in detention for 18 months. Nadra was left to look after her 2 kids all on her own without any sources of income. And so she tried to figure out what hustles she could do. She started cooking at home, trying to cater food, and followed the advice of the patriarchs of the family who said, just be quiet, just do prayers at home, and hope that he gets out. And after joining Drum, she decided that she was not going to stay at home, that she was actually going to go out. She was going to go confront the deportation officer. She was going to go talk to city council to change the laws that allowed this to happen. And in the words of one of our organizers, nothing says fuck the patriarchy better than taking those forms of action. Nadra helped pass a city council bill which limited the cases in which the NYPD could turn people over to immigration. And she made a pitch to the deportation officer that was probably the most convincing we've ever seen, that the deportation officer was like, you know what, actually, I will let your husband go, who came home after 18 months. And Nadra, who had stayed at home for all these years, was a transformed woman when her husband came back. And she was like, you're not gonna fucking talk to me like that. You are out here because I got your ass out here. And it's that transformation within people, not only to engage in political struggles, but also in personal transformation that we seek to do through the organizing work. 2 years ago, we were contacted by several Bangladeshi detainees at El Paso Detention Center who said that, hey, we've been locked up here for a few months and they're not letting us out and we're starting a hunger strike and people said we should contact you. And we're like, okay. And we were like, okay, it's a hunger strike, one detention center. We had sworn off doing work with detainees in about 2004 because it's very difficult work. So like, all right, we can support one hunger strike. They launch a hunger strike. In about 9 weeks, that hunger strike grows to 11 detention centers across the country with 250 detainees, mostly South Asian and some African. And it becomes a national issue. And when some of those hunger strikers were released from El Paso, we worked with those detainees to chase after and hunt down Bernie Sanders, O'Malley, who was another one of the presidential candidates, and Clinton. And they met with each one of these candidates and put their demands to them and demanded from them that, will you raise this issue as part of your election campaigns? And all 3 of them did. And those people, these are people who left Bangladesh because of the political situation there. They landed in Brazil, and then they walked their way up to the US-Mexico border, boated, hitchhiked their way up to the US-Mexico border, and then turned themselves in, claiming asylum. And their cases were routinely being denied. They were being limited their access to attorneys. They were being limited access to food. They were being limited access to medical care. And those were the reasons that led to the hunger strike. And that hunger strike was a cry, but it was also a demand. It was a demand that we will not continue to tolerate this, to be subjected to this kind of environment quietly. And at least 40 to 50 of those former hunger strikers and detainees are now members of DRUM and continue to do work with us and working on other issues of immigrant rights. I'll talk a little bit briefly about some of our other work. Some of our work is around the school-to-prison pipeline. Anybody here go to New York City public schools? All right. How many people here, whether New York City or not, had metal detectors in your public schools? Keep your hands up. Put your hands down if you're from New York City. So most of those hands went down, only a few stay up. In New York City, we spend $400 million a year to put police officers, metal detectors, and security guards in schools. Yet at Edison High School, which is close to where our office is, they are reading history books from the year 2000. We spend $400 million a year to put officers and metal detectors in school, but in Hillcrest High School, a teacher will give you extra credit if you bring in a ream of printer paper because the teacher does not have access to paper for the printer. What does that say about our priorities around education, particularly for poor working class communities of color? And these are the schools that our young people go to every day. And again, the same hierarchies play out. For the South Asian students, it is most of them graduate, most of whom families came here for a better future. They usually, after finishing high school, usually go to college, usually community college, doing service work, and if they're lucky, they end up with some sort of secretarial position at Wall Street or some company in Manhattan. But for black youth, it is a school-to-prison pipeline that many of them are being prepared to go into prisons because they're being denied education, they're being denied job opportunities, and the only place left to push them is into the underground economy, which then leads you into the prison system. And so we see these racial hierarchies. And when we talk about them with our own members, if they only look at their own struggles, it makes it very easy to become divided. Well, at least we're not those black kids. They're going to end up in prison. But if we understand the system that exists and the history of the system, we start to understand that the design of it is very intentional. It is very intentional that some students are channeled into the school-to-prison pipeline and other students are channeled into the school and low-wage pipeline. And it is the work of building those bridges, getting those youth to meet with each other, build relationships with each other, show up to protest with each other, organize with each other, to demand that we don't really just want changes only for ourselves, we want systemic changes that impact all of us and that bring about transformation for all of us. In New York City, our Worker Center work focuses very locally in the neighborhood that we work in the neighborhoods that we work in. In Jackson Heights, Queens, the average wage on the 2 blocks where the South Asian businesses are is $5 an hour. A minimum wage in New York State, anyone? Depending, it varies by industry, but 10, 50, 11 is for many of the industries. A dank basement apartment in New York City, monthly rent, any guesses? Over 1,000, about 1,000. So somebody making $5 an hour in New York City, it wouldn't make sense anywhere else. It certainly doesn't make sense in New York City. But the reason that people will submit to it is because they're undocumented and they're living under the threat of, I will call police on you or I'll call immigration on you if you complain, even though there's laws against that. But again, the threat of state violence forces people into positions where their ability for their own livelihood, for their own health, for their own dignity is undermined and made impossible. Our newest program area is our gender justice work, started by one of our youth leaders who felt that while we were a women-led organization, that we weren't having explicit conversations about gender within our everyday work. She created a leadership development program working with young women, and they ran this program for several months and ended with a launching of a campaign against street harassment of women in public spaces, on how do we start to engage people in public spaces around how to make a welcoming public space, what the impacts of street harassment are, how do we call out manifestations of street harassment as men and as women. And our last program area is global justice, understanding that our struggles are connected to the world and to the struggles across the world. A lot of this has meant anti-war work, which unfortunately under the previous administration largely died because our movements, longer conversation dynamics, democratic presidencies, and anti-war movements. But also then it includes Palestine solidarity work and understanding that how our struggles are integrally connected to the people of Iraq, the people of Honduras, the people of Palestine, where American wars directly and indirectly are the cause of some of the greatest devastation that we see in our world. It is also around migrant rights and worker rights, the massive flow of migrants across the world, probably the largest numbers of migrants in motion in human history. Millions and millions of people putting their livelihoods, their children, their families on boats that they don't know whether they will make them across, crossing deserts that seem endless, that are endless, crossing borders that are militarized and that seek to keep them from crossing over to safety. What is our obligation as people living in the United States, as the promoter and perpetrator of many of those policies? What is our obligation to the rest of the world? So this is like sort of a summation of a lot of our work. And as I mentioned, the lens of state violence is very central in all of it, because we see that state violence is where the most, has the greatest impact on the lives of people, not only in our membership, but in our communities, in our country, and across the world. And this state violence has been carried out regardless of which administration or which party is in power. Under the previous administration, 3 million, almost 3 million immigrants were deported, the most ever in US history. And the mechanisms and the structure that was built up to do those deportations has now been handed over to proto-fascists, who will probably do a lot more with it. And so that brings us back to the importance of state violence. I want to talk a little bit about our, is anybody giving me time? 5 minutes, okay. I want to talk a little bit about our current political moment. So we have proto-fascists in power. Let's not be shy about it. Let's not kind of like try to talk about them in other ways. They're an amalgamation of white supremacists, white nationalists, misogynists, proto-fascists, but I think proto-fascist kind of captures all of it together. These are not people that we negotiate with, that we compromise with. I'll give you this, you give us that. Fascists don't care about negotiation. They don't care about like relationships. They want to eliminate people, I think, as the professor rightly pointed out. They seek the elimination of people, either by deportation, either by incarceration, but also if by arms. And so a framework that we've been using around this current political moment is cede no ground. That this is not the moment to negotiate. This is not the moment to have dialogue, to have congenial discourse. We will not cede any ground. We will not give an inch to proto-fascists. And that requires for all of us to figure out how do we organize ourselves that we are able to actually stand by that demand, stand by that call that we will not cede to them. And in the assessment that we've made since the election results, a major recognition is that we, as movements, as left movements, as progressive movements, are not strong enough. If these people take arms, as they have started to do, and start showing up to our neighborhoods, start showing up to our communities, there's limitations to how much we can confront people that are armed. If they show up to our neighborhood right now in Jackson Heights, we could probably protest against them. But if they come with arms, or if they decide to perpetrate violence, we are actually not organized to fight back. So a question that must be asked is, what would it take for us to be able to fight back? What kind of people do we need involved? What breadth and what depth of people do we need to be involved to be able to defend ourselves and to be able to fight back? And a thinking around this has been around the notion of sanctuary. The idea of sanctuary has been very common in the immigrant rights movement, but it has also been very, very narrowly focused only on immigrants. What about sanctuary for trans people in our neighborhoods and in our communities and in our country? What about sanctuary for Black people from violence and police violence that is perpetrated every 28 hours, if not more, in this country? What about sanctuary for women from street harassment, from domestic violence? What would it mean if we expanded our notions of sanctuary to be inclusive of all the people who face all forms of violence and are particularly being targeted in this current moment? What would that sanctuary look like? And a lot of our thinking has been that that kind of sanctuary can really only be built in our neighborhoods. The importance of organizing in our neighborhoods, going door to door, going business to business, and asking people, what steps are you willing to take to make your business, to make your home, to make yourself safe and make other people safe? And bringing people to be a part of our movements who often are not. Everyday people, people that are not activists, people that may not have gone to college and done critical studies courses or had lessons, but people that are just trying to get by. Street vendors, cab drivers, domestic workers, home workers, parents, kids. What would it take for us to bring people together to not only fight against the attacks that we are facing, but also to start to build a community that reflects a vision of the world that we want to see? We've been using a framing calling hate-free zones to really kind of build that neighborhood-based model. But in our work and also in efforts across the country, we are seeing that this is a similar struggle going on. Just kind of as an aside, I am always, people that are from Muslim communities or people that focus on Middle Eastern or Muslim studies are often like graded upon by like these framings of battle for the soul of Islam and battle for the soul of the Middle East. And I think it's a very, because it's a very condescending conversation, but it's a very opportune moment to kind of frame battle for the soul of America as the struggle that we're going through right now. But we are very much engaged in a battle about what the next America will look like. We have reactionaries that want to promote a white supremacist, nationalist, hyper-masculinist version of America. And then the question is on us. What is our vision? What would that America look like? What would the neighborhoods in America look like for that to be a reality? And to start the day-to-day building blocks of building those communities and starting to build a society that we want to see. I want to end with just kind of three principles that I would like folks to leave folks with. One, this is particularly one directed towards college students. Nothing spoils the capacity of people to organize than going to college. And I say this with tongue-in-cheek, but also very seriously. Our universities are very great at creating critics. and analyzing and critiquing things. But the work of organizing is not just being critical, it's also around learning how to build. How to, not just to recognize the contradictions that exist within us individually, within our interpersonal relationships, within our communal relationships, but also how to resolve them, how to work past them. And many of even our own youth that got trained in our organizing model, when they go to college and when they come back, we're like, you're not in, you need to do like some other work before you get involved in the leadership of the organizing work. Because the academy trains people to be great activists who can point out what's wrong and can be loud about it, but not really around how do we solve what's wrong? How do we present the vision, and how do we bring together the people who would lead us towards that vision? And so I hope those of you that are college students would take that. A second framing that we use often in our membership is really around notions of solidarity. A phrasing that we use is, are we standing for justice or are we standing for just us? Our notions of justice are often very limited to what our needs are, either individually or as communities. But our struggles for justice really are interlinked with the people around us and people across the world. As long as bombs are being rained down in Yemen, in Afghanistan, we really can't talk about our liberation here. We have to understand how our liberation is fundamentally tied to it, and we have an obligation to figure out solutions and create a world where those struggles are linked and where that liberation is linked. And the last one, which I've already hinted at, is learning both how to fight and also how to build. We need to fight. Our movements have two tendencies. Those that just like to fight. What are we fighting against? And they do a great job at fighting, but that sort of orientation often causes us to internalize a lot of the same dynamics that we're fighting against. Those of us that have been involved in activist or organizing circles often see the reperpetration of patriarchy, of misogyny, of heterosexism, of racism play out within our movements, within our activist circles, within our organizing circles. We have another segment of our movements that are very focused just on building. Me and my circle of folks, and how do we build with each other, and how do we have relationships with each other, but often sitting in rooms or sitting in places where a whole world is moving outside and is completely disconnected and disassociated from it. We cannot build liberation in a vacuum or in a small bubble or in safe spaces. Struggle is messy. Struggle is difficult, messy work. It requires us to balance these two things, learning how do we fight against the unjust systems and unjust processes that exist, while also trying to build and create the relationships, the dynamics, the communities, and the processes that will eventually lead to, that foretell the vision that we have of the world that we want to build. Thank you.